call? Anybody else? No? Okay, well, that's good. Welcome to all the new folks, and welcome to everybody who's returning. See some old friends here as well as some newer folks. It's really good to have you all. So look, let's kick into the call tonight. So thank you all, first of all, for making the time to join this evening. For those of you that are for whom this is not your first call, you'll know that there have been a lot of challenges to the way that the UK tackles the fight against global poverty that we've been talking about over the last few months, both political and in the wider world. Tonight we're going to try and look at that all in a wider context. So let's start with something big. So this 25th of September saw the 5th anniversary of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're sometimes called the Global Goals. These were goals agreed by all the leaders of the world back in the United Nations in the year 2015. In case there's anybody in the call who hasn't come across these yet, they're a set of 17 interconnected goals which hold countries responsible for delivering a more prosperous, sustainable, and equal future for all people everywhere, wherever you happen to live, in a rich country or what's currently called a developing country. The goals include not just the things that we at Results work on, ending global poverty, Goal 1, nutrition, Goal 2, health and well-being, Goal 3, education, Goal 4, but also goals on things like climate change, peace and justice, and clean energy. If you go up and look up the goals, you'll see that there are actually 169 specific targets that lie beneath them so that we can assess whether we're achieving them or not. As a set, they look incredibly ambitious, but they're a really compelling description of the world that we want to see. And most importantly for us in Results, we believe, even today, that these are achievable if enough political will is shown and if countries work together in solidarity to achieve them. And this is really what the work of Results is all about, helping to make this happen through our advocacy. So much so that we include this in our mission statement at Results. We are working towards a world free of poverty by the year 2030. In fact, this goes well beyond the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. They talk about a world free from extreme poverty in Goal 1.1. I'm going to come back to why this one word matters quite a bit in a minute. We're actually going to put a link in the chat box to a recent blog post by Beatrice Coates, or B Coates. She's our Policy Advocacy Coordinator at Results. She wrote it to mark the 5th anniversary of the goals. It's a great blog. Do give it a read. Now, there's quite a few challenges that we've been facing up to that I mentioned earlier, some more recent, some that have been building up for many years. And it's important that we continue to face these even as we maintain our evidence-backed belief that ending poverty is possible. First, the rise of political narratives that articulate a more inward-looking Britain, that don't see the value of investing in health, education, and economic opportunities in poor countries, let alone seeing the moral imperative of addressing current and historic oppression that we see being so prevalent still in the world. Second, some of the changes in the strategy of the current government, which now seeks to use UK aid in our national interest, rather than as a fundamentally moral issue, as we believe, for the elimination of global poverty. And third, changes to the machinery of government, such as the merger of our Department for International Development and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, whose implications we've yet to fully see. And then, of course, there is the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as we shall hear in a minute, and as we've already discussed a few times now in these monthly calls, has the capacity to massively put back our efforts and undo some of the progress that has been made in tackling poverty. I want to come back briefly to this idea of progress in tackling poverty, which is itself contentious. Although, as a small aside, I want to note that anyone who's seen David Attenborough's latest documentary on Netflix, A Life on Our Planet, may have spotted that his #1 recommendation for saving the environment was ending global poverty, with #2 being health for all, and #3, education for girls. And only after those did he follow with much more environmentally focused recommendations. And so I'd like to think that if Sir David Attenborough is on your side, you're probably doing something right. But back to ending global poverty. So the World Bank has a definition of extreme poverty, which is currently if you are living on an average income of less than $1.90 per day per person in your household. That's about £1.50 per person per day. First, hopefully it's very clear that you could be living on quite a bit more than £1.50 a day and still not be anywhere near being able to sustain yourself and your family in any kind of life that you would describe as easy or with dignity. So second, we see this in lots of our work on specific issues on access to health and education, that there's no way that a simple indicator of wealth or lack of it can adequately describe what poverty is in real life. As we know, it's intimately bound up in not having your voice heard, in mental well-being as well as physical health, in the inequality that exists within and between countries, and in access to rights and services. This is why at Results, we recently decided to take the word extreme poverty out of our mission statement and instead just refer to poverty. Now, this isn't because we think we can fix everything and that we have a bigger ambition than we already do, nor is it because we don't think that we need to focus on those most in need and the most marginalized of people. Of course we do, and this is where we should start. But we don't think it's right to just use an economic indicator like $1.90 per day, or another one, a country's gross domestic product or wealth per capita, and think that somehow once you're over this magical income threshold, then that fixes everything, because it just demonstrably doesn't. Just as one example, Nigeria is now classified as a middle income country primarily because of its oil revenues, yet it has one of the most broken and inadequate healthcare systems anywhere in the world. So much so that it has had to have its support from Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, extended for a few more years, despite its increasing income. So this isn't just semantics. It really matters in our campaigning, as we're often talking about the reality of progress or the lack thereof. If things are getting better, we should tell people so and give them hope that the things they want to see for everyone in an ideal world, health, education for their families, worthwhile jobs, are actually achievable. We should shout about some of the massive strides forward we've been able to make, such as long-term sustained funding for the fight against AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria we've seen since the turn of the millennium. Statistics like the number of people living in absolute poverty as having halved since the turn of the millennium, judged by this numerical standard, can be really useful to help illustrate this progress, despite this headline figure missing out on the important details like levels of inequality or different accesses to services. We do need more and better measures for those willing and able to look into the details. And if we want to maintain our credibility, if we're not making progress, we should say that too and argue for greater focus and ambition. So, every year, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation releases a report on the achievement against some of the global goals, particularly around health, which they focus a lot of their attention on. These reports have sometimes been described as being a bit overly optimistic, partly because the scope of the report means it has to make use of averages, big headline figures that can inadvertently mask important details about people's lives. But this year, the Gatekeepers report is very downbeat about the huge challenges to the progress that we're making. Patchy and limited though it is in places, caused by COVID, which our speaker is going to be able to elaborate on. I mean, I've used the central message from last year's Gatekeepers report in quite a few results communications. It was, progress is possible, but it's not inevitable. This year, the report admits, and I quote, we have to confront the current reality with candor. This progress has now stopped. So a link to the 2020 Goalkeepers report is going up in the chat box if it's not already there, so you can read the assessment for yourself. I should say these reports always provide some very useful and insightful graphs about progress against several specific indicators, so do make the time to look through for the global goals that you're most interested in. As I said, we're about to hear more of the details of this from our speaker, but I don't want to leave us only with the negatives in spite of these challenging times. Results advocates genuinely have the opportunity to do something really positive about the current situation that the world is in, and a huge thank you from me for the way you guys do this every month. And your pleas don't always fall on deaf ears. I was really heartened by the recent words of the Prime Minister, something I don't all that often have called to say, but he spoke to the UN last weekend on the need for global cooperation to fight the COVID pandemic. He said, and again I quote, and after 9 months of fighting COVID-19, the very notion of the international community looks, frankly, pretty tattered. And we know that we simply can't continue in this way. unless we get our act together. Unless we unite and turn our fire against our common foe, we know that everyone will lose. The inevitable outcome would be to prolong this calamity and increase the risk of another. Again, I'm going to put a link to the speech into the chat box if it's not already there. It is actually well worth reading in full if you have the time, because Prime Minister Johnson expands on those words, on those ideas. But of course, what we need now is for those words to be put into action. And you and I have the chance over the coming months to hold him to account for exactly that. I'm going to end on that note. That's it for me for now. I'm going to hand over to Dela for the usual roundup of all your advocacy activities around the UK in the last month. Over to you, Dela.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm actually going to start with a couple of campaign-y things that we may have coming up. So welcome to all the new people. If it's too much information, we post it all in our blog afterwards. So if you want to have a little read over what we said, you can do. So yeah, this is what we are thinking we have coming up. I wanted to thank everyone who wrote to the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, last month about the things we think that the department should focus on or prioritise going forward. Do let us know if you've got any responses. I haven't heard from anyone that you have yet. So if you've had one and not mentioned it, let me know. So this month's action very much builds on what we did last month, but we're trying to get our MPs to use their online platform to try and push some of these priorities forward. Ring fencing education spending, pledging to reach 50 million people with nutrition programs, for example. All that information is in the action sheet. I just wanted to say, if this is going to be your first media or social media action, do have a go. You'll only get more familiar with it, and I'm sure better with time. It's a bit of a shift from a lot of the letter writing we do, but I'm sure you can handle it, and let us know how it goes. So the next thing I wanted to mention was on the DFID merger with the Foreign Office, so the new department, FCDO. I know loads of you took action on that, and just a massive thank you for mobilising around that. We've had some intel on that situation, which is that we're expecting sometime before Christmas that there'll be a free vote in Parliament on what happens to the future of the International Development Committee, meaning that MPs are free to choose and don't have to sort of vote with the party on whether the committee remains or not. So as those of you who've already campaigned on the merger will know, we think the IDC or the committee is a really essential part of having aid spending thoroughly scrutinised and ensure that it's focused on where it's really needed. So yes, we'll be asking you to take action probably at some point before Christmas, and we'll let you know when we think the best time is. And just, yeah, wanted to remind you that I suppose the power you have in engaging your MP on that is literally all to play for. The government don't seem to have a preference for whether there is a committee or not. We definitely think there should be. So yes, just remember how much influence you can have with your MP. Before the end of the year as well, we're going to be, well, we were hoping to do more campaigning on education, but the GPE, so the Global Partnership for Education, something we're hoping the government would commit financially to. It's a fund that's dedicated to transforming education in lower income countries. They've pushed the timeline back for when they're going to need or when they're going to be ready to ask for funding. So probably in the new year, we'll be taking action on that. Lots of you have been campaigning already on nutrition for growth and ensuring that the UK commits spending for nutrition programs abroad. So we probably will be asking you to take action on this again before the end of the year. And I just wanted to mention that World Food Day is coming up on October the 16th. So if you wanted to focus your social media or media action around that moment, you can do. That's one of the options in the action sheet. So just a heads up. Okay, that's it for the campaign stuff. I hope that all made sense. Just quickly then, I wanted to thank everyone who came to our national conference. It feels like ages ago now, but it was only last month. So yeah, a huge thank you. It's not the same as all meeting up in person, but you all came and were super enthusiastic. So yeah, very much appreciated that you gave up your weekends for that. I'm going to put a link in the chat for the recordings for the sessions if you want to catch up on anything that you missed. And I just wanted to say, do let us know if you had a go at the gentle protest letter writing sort of challenge. I'll post the link to the guide in the chat box, as well, as you might find some of the language tips useful for doing immediate action this month as well. So I have a couple of opportunities for Advocacy Day meetings, so I will talk you through them, but I'll put them in the chat as well. So for anyone who doesn't know, we normally have an Advocacy Day the day after our national conference, but obviously the fact that it was virtual this year meant that we've kind of had online meetings scheduled for you guys to get involved with, and they've been a bit more spread out, not on the same day. So thanks to everyone who joined the meeting with Susan Eldon. So she is leading on the FCDO's work on immunisation. It sounds like it was a really great success. I've read the notes. It sounds like you grilled her and she gave us some really interesting information as well. So thank you for that. We've got some spaces left for remaining meetings that we have scheduled. So we have a meeting with Abigail Perry, who leads the FCDO's work on nutrition. That's happening on the 15th of October in the morning. So if you're interested, let us know. We could probably squeeze a couple more people into that meeting. We also have one scheduled with David Mundell, who's an MP who chairs the Nutrition for Growth All-Party Parliamentary Group. So that's on the 28th of October. We've also got a meeting with Sarah Champion, who heads up the International Development Committee. She's also an MP, on the 12th of November. We think we have enough people for that, but if anyone drops out, you can express interest and we'll let you know. Yes, so I've been speaking for quite a while. I just wanted to give a quick shout out before I hand back over to Aaron. I don't know if she's on the call, but Fiona in London has been doing a lot of work with her MP Neil Coyle on the merging of the departments, and just wanted to say congratulations to her. She did a really good job of following up with an online meeting they had recently, and Neil's going to be sending a letter to the Prime Minister on what we think should be prioritised when it comes to the new department, so well done. Maybe I'll throw it open quickly, just see if one person wants to feedback on anything that they've done this month or that they're looking forward to doing next month. Just unmute yourself and shout out if you've got anything to share quickly. Maybe I'll pick on someone if no one's volunteering. Is there anyone from Brighton on the call? I know you have a freshers event coming up. I don't know if maybe one of you wanted to tell us a bit about what you've got planned.
Hi, Dela.
Hi, Hugh.
Unfortunately, I can't tell you too much about it, but I know that there are plans. I think the date's been pushed back a couple of weeks.
Okay.
But yeah, they'll be doing a presentation of everything Results does to Brighton University of Sussex freshers. So hopefully there'll be a lot of interest and intake following that.
Amazing. I hope it goes well. It'd be good to hear a bit more when it's happened. So thanks, Hugh.
Yeah.
Cool. I think unless anyone else is eager to unmute themselves, that'll be it from me. And I'll just put the information I just shared in the chat box as well. So yeah, thanks everyone. Back to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Dela, and thanks to you all for the advocacy that you've been doing in the last month since we spoke, and for everything you're about to. It's great. So let's jump across to the topic of tonight's call. And as usual, it's now time to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. It's really my great privilege to introduce Lilei Chow from Save the Children. I see you've been with us for a while, Lilei, so welcome to the call. You've heard some of our housekeeping. Thank you so much for joining us. Lilei is the Senior Policy and Advocacy Adviser at Save the Children. She leads on the Sustainable Development Goals that I was talking about right at the start of this call. She's also a co-chair of the BOND Sustainable Development Goal Group, which helps coordinate all of the different NGOs and charities work on the Sustainable Development Goals, and helps us to speak with one voice when necessary, when we need to hold the government to account and push them to do things around the SDGs. So Lilei, look, we're really grateful that you're giving up part of your evening to share your experiences with us. You've seen that we've got volunteer campaigners from all around the UK, from Scotland to the South Coast, some with lots of experience of advocacy on international development issues, been doing this for many years, some who are brand new. Some of them will know all about the SDGs, but will be potentially new to some of the stuff we're talking about tonight. but hopefully you can see from the enthusiasm that everybody's keen to do their bit to help fight against global poverty. And lots of people are going to be taking action this month, so really happy to hear from you this evening. As always, we have a few opening questions after which that we've shared with our speaker in advance, and we'll go to those first. And then after that, we'll open the discussion for people to ask questions. Of course, as per normal, you can put them in the chat box and text and all that. But before we get into all of that, I always like to start, Lilei, by asking you to introduce yourself to folks on the call. And importantly, if you can share with us, what is it that motivates you to do the work that you do at Save the Children, and particularly, well, why the SDG framework?
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me. I've wanted to work on development issues since I was a teenager, actually. I started volunteering to work on environmental issues when I guess I was a bit of a climate activist when I was in secondary school, and I was trying to fight the construction of the mega dam in Borneo called Bakun back then. We didn't succeed in the fight, but I was determined to continue and get into the career in development. So I started my career with the UN. Had a bit of a break where I did my master's, and I went back actually to Borneo and to see the impact that dam had on the people, the indigenous communities that lived on the land. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that. But I am a big fan of multilateralism and international cooperation. And I also believe truly that the SDGs are the best framework that we have to get us from where we are now to a brighter future for all, not just for the few. And if you've been working in the sector for as long as I have, I suppose you would see that actually the SDGs go a lot further than their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals. For example, by saying that it's not just progress for the average that counts, but it's that progress needs to be inclusive and it needs to leave no one behind.
Thanks, Lilei. That's a wonderful introduction, and wonderful to hear a little bit of your personal journey and story. It's one of my favorite parts of the call. So we're going to go to a small number of pre-arranged questions. We've got 3 tonight. When we get out of those, if you want to text in a question, for those on the telephones, you can send an SMS to 0777 56 11178. That's 0777 56 11178. For those of you that are actually on Zoom in front of a laptop or a computer or whatever, if you can find the chat button, you can type a question in there too. But for now, we're going to go across to our first question, which I believe is going to come from Brighton.
Yeah, hi again. Yeah, hi Lilei. Thanks so much for all your insights this evening. The first question is, we hear that some progress has been made towards tackling poverty. Which SDGs are we succeeding on, and where are we being less successful?
Thanks for that, Hugh. So I remember when I was preparing sort of my brief in 2019 to report to sort of Save the Children on progress on the goals, we were seeing some progress, modest progress. For example, on SDG 1, on monetary poverty, we were seeing some on education, getting more girls into schools, and we were seeing that. And so think about this: that after the 2007-2008 recession, we were finally seeing employment levels sort of restored to that level before the global recession. So we were seeing progress, but overall, I think last year was the first year we kind of took stock and realized that we actually were severely off track to meet most of the SDGs, and the targets that were going to expire in 2020, and there was some we were not going to meet any of those. So it was a worrying picture. We have seen some progress in, for example, reducing child mortality, maternal mortality, we're seeing some improvement in SDG implementation, governments beginning to put into plans and beginning to put gender responsive budgeting, but really we weren't seeing the progress that we needed to get us to 2030 and achieve the SDGs. I think the important part is that despite this global progress, if you look at global progress, inequalities in between and in between countries and within countries have continued to rise, almost inexorably. Like we're seeing, so our Save the Children, our research has shown that there are persistent gaps that exist between, let's say, the top 20% of households in any given country and the bottom 20% of households, and these gaps showed no signs of closing. And so it was really, we were we were already a little bit worried about the SDG progress before COVID-19 hit. So overall, I would say that progress really hasn't matched the kind of ambition that the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs seek to have.
Thanks, Lilei. I think that's potentially a good segue through to our second question, which is going to come from Manchester.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Lilei. It's been really insightful so far, and I really look forward to hearing the rest of the call today. So the question I have for you today is the COVID-19 pandemic a long-term challenge to development, or are many poor countries struggling anyway to meet the SDGs?
So I would say the COVID-19 is, I think, the biggest threat to human development in our generation. Save the Children and UNICEF have recently done revised figures on multidimensional poverty, and Aaron alluded to it. It's very hard to get a picture of what a person living in poverty is really like if you just use the income measure. A lot of the time, people living in poverty are completely disempowered because they face multiple deprivations across various indicators, whether it is education, access to education, sanitation, nutritious food, clean water. And in the case of child poverty, it actually makes a lot of sense to look at the multidimensional figures, because they're actually not supposed to be earning a living in the first place, but also because they tend to face the intensity of multidimensional poverty more acutely than adults. So we are now looking at, for our estimates, we are looking at about an additional 150 million children will be pushed back into multidimensional poverty due to COVID, and that's a 15% increase. So we're looking at a total of 1.2 billion children living in low and middle income poverty who are going to find it very difficult to escape the poverty trap. We're also seeing, disruptions in routine health and immunization services. So we're looking at under 5 mortality could now increase between something like 10 to 45%, setting us back, I think I'm going to quote the Gates report, because I think it's a very succinct picture. We've been set back about 25 years in terms of development in 25 weeks by this pandemic. I think in addition to that, we're also looking at the deepest economic recession since World War II. And this is going to have the biggest impacts on countries with already high levels of debt and informality and dependence on sectors like tourism. I think also probably worth underscoring that while this virus has impacted every country around the globe, its effects are being felt by the most marginalized and deprived groups within the countries. So it's making existing inequalities much worse, and certain groups are being pushed further behind, such as girls, children with disabilities, and informal workers.
It's tough to hear, but it's important. Thank you for sharing. That's really a very powerful and challenging analysis, Lilei. We're going to go across to Paul for the third question.
Hello, Lily. Welcome to our call. It all sounds a bit grim so far. We do hear that our government has a commitment to achieving the SDGs. So what can they do more of that they're not currently doing already?
So the UK has did play a very key role in the oops.
No, we've still got you.
Okay.
Yep.
Phew. The UK did play a very important role in the negotiations for the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's worth underscoring. In particular, it is recognized by the UN as being one of the most forward-looking countries on the Leave No One Behind agenda. So I would like the UK to, I think, step up its game in that area, pushing for progress, calling for countries to support progress that is not just, it's inclusive, it's just, and it's sustainable. The UK is also currently leading negotiations at the UN on recovering back better, the financing architecture around that. And that's a very important role that we're tracking closely. And we would like to see, obviously, a continued focus on poverty reduction and reducing inequality within there. So at the UN General Assembly last week, Dominic Raab did cite as one of the priorities for the UK was to ensure that the recovery from COVID would leave no one behind. So I think this is important that we hold the government to account on that. I think in addition to that, the UK, in the past, a lot of its positions, for example, that it would have had at the UN would have been negotiated through the EU delegation. It now has a chance to shape its own policy priorities. And we as a sector, we as campaigners or within the sector can help to shape that and call what we think the UK should prioritize. So there is, I think, within the current government discourse, I think there is there are challenges to making sure that poverty reduction is front and center, and that because environmental concerns don't crowd out some of these other priorities. So continue to call for that to be a priority for the UK government. The FCDO merger, while many of us were disappointed with it, does also provide an opportunity, because we're now looking at a government, a department with arguably an expanded mandate. So this is an opportunity for the UK to get, for example, implementation of the goals. Is it going to be in a better position to have cross-government delivery of the goals? The BOND SDG Group for a very long time has been calling for the implementation of the SDGs to be sort of maybe within cabinet office. In many developed countries, it is usually within the Prime Minister's implementation unit and all that. I'm not sure necessarily if we're going to succeed in getting it into cabinet office under this current administration. But I think more importantly, we should be calling for that the implementation of the SDGs follow some of the key principles of Agenda 2030, and that includes policy coherence. It includes, recognizing that the SDGs are the economic, social, and environmental aspects. They're all, integrated. They're indivisible. They're universal. They apply not just abroad but domestically as well. And I think also we should push for these for the SDG implementation in the UK to be costed and budgeted for. I'm sorry, I know this is a bit technical.
Well, I mean, some of these things are technical, and I think that's why we have you on the call to help unpack some of those for folks and let them ask you questions. So no, don't. Well, let's dig into some of that as we go to the floor. So we don't have any questions in the chat yet. So I think we please do jump some questions in there. But while people are lining that up, I just do want to say, Lily, thanks for those. What were those answers to the 3 pre-prepared questions? What we're actually going to do just now is put a link in the chat box to a blog post that Lily recently wrote on why the SDGs should be the cornerstone of the global policy agenda for the new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO. So that should be going in the chat box just now, so you can browse that at your leisure and drill down into some more of Lily's thoughts around this. But I'm going to open the floor to anyone who would like to actually ask a question. Does somebody want to go off mute, yell out your question to Lily? Do you have anybody brave enough? If not, why don't we go to, oh, wait, did I hear something?
All right, I've put it in the chat box, so I've got one to ask. I'll ask it, okay?
Go ahead, Jill.
Yeah, DFID used to be the lead on the SDGs in the UK as well, the implementation of the SDGs. And I always thought that was a good thing, that we weren't making a differentiation between overseas and the UK, that it was for everywhere, leave no one behind. Is there any indication that the FCDO will be doing the same sort of thing? Will they be leading on the SDGs in the UK?
Thanks, Jill. So you're absolutely right. It was, I think DFID had the expertise to sort of lead the sort of international work of the SDGs. I think what the challenge with that was it tended not to be seen as a domestic agenda. I mean, I know there's been some good progress in Wales, etc., but it tended to be quite fragmented in its cross-government delivery because it sat with DFID, and DFID wasn't necessarily in a position to influence the other departments. So now, it being with the FCDO, the SDG team has remained. I'm pleased to say it has expanded. It now includes sustainable financing. So that's all good. It actually, I suppose, doesn't really matter where it sits, where SDG implementation sits. What is more important is that we have a plan that that looks at how the different government departments are working together and how they can work together to deliver on the SDGs domestically and internationally. So, for example, you do not have your ambitious environmental programs abroad while continuing to subsidize fossil fuels. That sort of policy incoherence which we have seen in terms of the UK's policy, both abroad and domestically.
Thanks, Lily. That's a really helpful answer. I'm learning all sorts of new things. Very good. We've got a couple of other really good questions in the chat box. Let's take them in order. Cameron is asking, if the goals are not met in 2030, what happens? Are they backed by penalties if countries don't live up to their promises and they're not met?
Unfortunately, the goals, while they are in an international agreement, they are not legally binding. But I think what I've seen in the conversations that I'm seeing at the UN level is that, unlike the past few years, there is a real recognition by both rich as well as developing countries that we can't go on as business as usual. So it's no longer just the UN Secretary General going, we can't go back to the past. It's countries, prime ministers, even Boris Johnson saying that we can't afford to go back to business as usual. And so I see this year and sort of the recovery from this crisis is a real opportunity for us to push to ensure that we don't go back, or we don't put plasters on our challenges. And I think the pandemic has really shown how the scale of the challenges that we're facing, whether it's this pandemic or climate change, really cannot be tackled in isolation. And there's a real, I suppose, growing recognition now that it's often the people and the countries that have had the least to do with creation of the problems that are being the most severely impacted. And so I think we have a moment. I personally I sort of feel that there is now this kind of like, okay, you know, we need to get serious about it. And it's up to us, you know, people and civil society to hold governments to account on these promises.
Thanks, thanks very much, Lilei. Let's jump over Lucy's question for now, but come back to it. Just we won't forget it, Lucy. Let's go to Hunter's question. 2030 is 10 years from now, so it could be hard to envision what the world will look like, and that they'll be met, you know, all that long distance in the future. For those of us with slightly shorter time horizons, for example, elected politicians, are there shorter term goals as well? And are we on track for those? Similar, if we're looking at 2050 carbon zero goals. And we've had a reply already that some of the targets have a 2020 target that you talked about earlier, but are there others? Like where can we go to find out some of those details? And where are the next check-in points that we are going to be looking forward to?
So they're looking at 2025 as sort of the next big point, because that would be, I think, you know, we look at these intervals. It's going to be difficult for us to meet the goals without some serious, I think, concerted efforts, and, you know, for rich countries to take responsibility and to step up. So the UK is one of the few countries that is currently meeting its ODA commitments of, you know, 0.7. We need more countries to do that. We need the countries, we need the UK to use its G7 presidency next year and its COP26 presidency to really galvanize people around that, you know, to not just on, you know, climate change, but also for developing countries. What's going to be very crucial, whether they can pull out of this and they can recover and get back on track, it's going to be things around, like, say, you know, debt relief moratoriums and stuff like that. So helping these countries to make sure that they don't buckle because they are servicing debt.
Thanks, Lilei. That's really helpful. Let's go back to Lucy's question. Do you have any advice for us as we advocate on the Sustainable Development Goals? Given that's your job, I'm sure you've got loads of things to share. She goes on to ask, is there anything that you found that tends to particularly capture people's attention?
It is difficult to advocate on the SDGs because it's, you know, 17 goals, covers everything. I would pick one issue that you care about, and don't put it as an SDG, just put it as a story. So, for example, I often use the voices of children. So there is, you know, every year world leaders kind of meet at the high level political forum, and this year I was like, I'm not going to speak. I'm going to talk about this boy, Kamuti, and he spoke for Save the Children, and he was part of a group of children in Zambia that got together and decided that, you know, the government is producing its progress report to the UN. We're going to produce a child-led report. So they gathered together, went around Zambia, interviewing children about what was important to them. And he brought these stories to the forum, and it was really well received. You know, one of the things that I think we tend to underestimate is that children and youth really have the power as agents of change, you know, and I'm seeing more and more that there is a recognition that they need to have a seat at the table. So I would say make the story personal. You know, it's often difficult to advocate for all the 17 goals. So pick an issue that matters to you, you know, and have a real personal story behind it.
Thanks, Lilei. I think that's a great advice, and I think you're now starting to see why we ask people to tell a little bit of their personal story when they come on as guest speakers. We've got a couple of we've got a bunch of questions flooding through into the chat. Let's sorry, I can't read them quick enough. Right. Okay, right. Let's do Rachel and Kerry's questions together. So with the current pandemic and the economic implications of it, international aid could well be pushed lower down on the agenda to protect domestic interests. How can we convince governments to stay committed to global development at this time? And a complementary question, do you think the crisis mode we're now in with COVID will draw attention away from sustainable change in terms of most of the goals?
I think I draw comfort in the fact that I believe the SDGs are the way we're going to get out of it, the best chance we have to get out of this crisis and to make sure that we usher in a world that is, you know, bright for our children and their children. I think there is a chance that, you know, there will be some, and certainly the current climate of multilateralism, you know, if you followed any of the proceedings at UNGA, you know, you did see there have been a lot of attacks on multilateralism. But I do believe the vast majority of countries are on board. I think what we need now to do is to continue to advocate for why we cannot solve this crisis alone. And we're all basically, we will not recover until the poorest country in Africa recovers. And that is the truth.
Yeah, thanks, Lilei. That's very powerful. I'm also reminded of a newspaper article I saw in The Guardian where the UK government spent over £500 million on ventilators, that are most of which are not being used. And then just last week, the UK government spent £500 million on research and development for a vaccine that will be shared with the world. And the idea that somehow, almost out of nowhere, we managed to find £1 billion, 500 million that was spent entirely at home and maybe not spent all that well, but another 500 million that was spent in some of the most generous and impactful ways we could spend it in terms of bringing about an end to the global crisis. That gives me hope too. And it's also a lesson in never let them tell you there's not enough money. Never.
Certainly. I mean, we are seeing now that, you know, governments, I mean, the rich countries at least, the advanced economies, have all been able to come up with huge amounts of money for recovery, huge amounts of money to suddenly, I mean, before this year, who had ever heard of furlough? Like, you know what I mean? You know, the countries are capable of responding in a concerted way and responding and getting the funds available. It's a matter of political will.
Thank you. Perfect answer. Let's go to Hugh's question. We probably have time for maybe one or two more after this, depending on how long Lilei takes to answer. Hugh asks, broadly speaking, in light of COVID, what seems to be the appetite for multilateral cooperation in terms of the North, South? Do we see different appetites in different regions? Does the funding gap for achieving the SDGs look likely to shrink or increase?
I think this year is going to be very crucial. A lot of important conversations are being held at the highest level. So, you know, the Prime Minister of Canada and Jamaica had convened that high-level meeting on financing for development in the light of COVID and the SDGs. And we are seeing some now quite ambitious and bold commitments being pledged. There is also some talk about next year maybe having a reconstruction summit, which would, you know, potentially bring more liquidity into the system. I think that, you know, the initiative to suspend the debt for the countries was a good thing. What is going to be key is if we can get the private sector on board, because right now they are not at the table. And that is a huge gap that, you know, if we can get the private sector on board and committed, I think it would go a long way to solve the sort of the funding gap that we're seeing.
Thanks, Lilei. We don't have any more questions in the chat. If you've got one, we're going to open up the lines to people to yell them out, because we are in the last few minutes, and I've just been learning so much so far, so I don't want to cut this off any earlier than we have to. Does anybody have any more questions or comments, observations for Lilei, or anybody in the office, either about the SDGs, some of the things you've heard tonight, or about the action that we're asking everybody to take once we get off the call? Lily might not be able to answer some of those, but we've got people on the call who can, if you've got a question about the action. So.
Can I?
Oh.
It's Reg from Paul. Lily, can I go ahead?
Go ahead, Reg.
Yeah, thanks. Lily, you said just now that we're not going to recover unless the poorest country recovers. What's the economic argument that supports that?
And actually, Cathy, do you want to ask your question as well, just so we can squeeze them in under the time?
Thank you. I'll just ask, it was on the comment that the private sector was not on board at present. I'm a bit concerned that the private sector has been a part of the development problem for a long time, the globalization and the multinationals. So what's the chances of getting private sector on board, does Lily think?
Two easy questions. Lily, you want to go for it?
I mean, so the first question, I'm not sure. So what's the economic argument?
What is there economic evidence that the crisis won't be over until until it's over in all countries, or is this more of an epidemiological argument?
I would say that, yeah, it's more of a health argument. It's more of the fact that global markets also really won't recover. You know, in a world where we're all basically, you know, our value chains, our supply chains are all interconnected. You know, you truly won't get over a recession of this magnitude and this, you know, and how deep this is without, you know, everybody sort of banding together, I would say.
And then the private sector.
Private sector, a lot of work has been done through sort of the UN Global Compact and stuff like that. They've got, you know, investors are coming on board slowly. We are starting to see, you know, new financial instruments being introduced. The private sector has always been a tricky one because they've been basically left to run amok. And, you know, they've been, especially, for example, in the US, where they control, you know, political parties. It's going to have to come from, you know, initiative by national governments banding together with the international system to get them on board.
Yeah. I think we've been indoctrinated for so long to the power of companies that we keep on forgetting that companies don't actually make laws. Politicians do, and politicians answer to the people on this call. That's how that is supposed to work. And so never for 1 second think that you don't have power. That is really, really true. We have only just a couple of minutes, and I want to leave us enough time to wrap up. So I'm thinking, unless anybody has a really, really urgent question, or there's something that they really want to comment on before we finish. No, okay. I will begin to start the wrap up, and I will start that by first of all saying a massive thank you, Lily, for giving up your time this evening to speak with us, for sharing your expert knowledge of the SDGs and your passion for why they're really so important. I think I agree with you. They're a very powerful framework for talking about how we're going to get out of the crisis that we're in right now. I think the leave no one behind agenda, the fact that the UK has always been very strong on this, has been a global leader, can still speak from a position of strength and authority in terms of our commitment to 0.7. The sort of things that we've announced even just last week around the 500 million pounds for vaccine development. I mean, these are all really good things that put us in a good place for our voices to help direct the UK government to do more and better on this, particularly as FCDO finds its footing. I hope everybody tonight has found this discussion useful, particularly if you're planning to take this month's campaign action, which I hope you do. It's to contact your local media or use your social media channels to try and get political support for the SDGs, particularly around this time of COVID, when we know there's just so much temptation for politicians to focus only on the UK and their own constituencies. Just a reminder, there's a whole world out there, and unless we work together as an international community, we won't succeed at home either. You've probably often heard us say that disease everywhere, anywhere is disease everywhere, and that's certainly true of this virus, which you'll know gets into all sorts of interesting places if you've been watching the news recently. So Lilei, just want to say a big thank you to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Real pleasure, real pleasure. And to everybody else on the call, very good luck in planning all of your activities this month. As always, the action materials we've sent out to you already, you should have those in your email, and they're available on our website under the Take Action section if you haven't got them. And I think Naveed shared them at the start of this call, so scroll up in the chat. They should give you some great ideas and tips and guidance. Dela and Naveed are always on the end of the phone line or Zoom call, ready to give help and advice if needed as well. If you were able to take last month's action, taking a similar message on tackling global poverty, but putting that directly into the inbox of the Foreign Secretary, then thank you very much for that. If you've had any replies and haven't forwarded them through to us yet, please do so. We'd love to see those. It can be quite enlightening to watch politicians' answers to your letters change over time as they receive more and more of them and realize that actually real people that take the time to craft these messages and actually send physical letters are writing to them. That is some of the best things that we see happen. It's very, very encouraging. So if you've enjoyed tonight and it's your first time, we hope to see you again. The next conference call will be on the first Tuesday of the month as normal. That's going to be Tuesday, the 3rd of November. You can mark your diaries now. That's a good night from me and from everybody at Results, and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Have a great day.